Good day to all of you. I am Jasmine with my partner Bea, and we're going to tackle the Ontological Argument by Saint Anselm of Canterbury and the 5 Ways of Aquinas. My segment is about the Ontological Argument of Saint Anselm of Canterbury. Let us start. Saint Anselm is a member of the Benedictine order and is a bishop of Canterbury, who extended the Augustine tradition of seeking to believe in order to understand the existence of God, rather than seeking to understand in order to believe in the truth and existence of God. Anselm believes that reason is necessary to explain and validate faith, even though many theologians avoid trusting reason from the fear of specter of skepticism. Anselm is considered to be the father of scholastic philosophy because of his work emphasizing linguistic and analytical thinking. But what is scholasticism? Scholasticism is a way of thinking and teaching knowledge. It gives emphasis on dialectical reasoning, or the process of knowing the truth by comparing and contrasting various solutions, which then is directed at answering questions or resolving contradictions. It is also said to be a classical philosophy with the teachings of Christian theology. Let us now proceed to the main topic for this segment, which is the ontological argument. Before we proceed, let us go through the work of Saint Anselm and determine why and what is the meaning of ontological argument. Proslogion is a prayer made by Saint Anselm of Canterbury in 1077 to 1078 that is based on reason and serves to reflect on the attributes of God to explain how he can possess seemingly contradicting qualities. In chapters 2 to 4 of his work, Saint Anselm introduces a new argument. This is what we call the ontological argument. There are other versions of this argument that are employed by Baruch Spinoza and René Descartes, which are not the same as Anselm's. In these chapters, Anselm is going to prove that God exists and that he truly is. In chapter 3, he argues that God cannot be thought to not exist. But not only that, he also argues that God is the greatest being and that there are no other beings above him. Anselm's argument actually comes from a Latin phrase, quo maius cogitari non potest, which translates to being which no greater can be conceived. This means that whoever or whatever you are thinking of, God is much greater than that. This is because Anselm thinks that perfection is the meaning of existence. So Anselm begins chapter 2 by saying to God that his image has been contained and wasted away by people like the fool, saying with his heart that there is no God, and that their vices are done because they think that there are no punishment for behaving badly and no rewards for doing well. Anselm was not bothered by their behavior. He was more worried that maybe their attitude is coherent to the existence of God. He was asking God, if the fool thinks or conceives that there is no God, then is his existence not true? But then, Anselm says that when the fool hears him saying the argument, quo maius cogitari non potest, and he understands what he hears, then his argument exists in the fool's understanding, or in the mind. The fool then knows what exactly he is affirming to not exist, and he understands what God would be like if he does exist. Anselm then uses an example of when a painter has an idea or a plan of what he is going to perform afterwards. It is in his understanding or in his mind, but he does not yet understand or thinks that it exists yet because he has not yet painted it, which means that the painter knows it doesn't exist because he has not painted it yet, or it has not been made. So Anselm says that even the fool must admit that the argument exists in his mind or understanding because he understands what God is, if he does exist. The fool hears this quote and understands it, meaning that it exists in his understanding. Now the question is, does this argument exist just in the understanding, or does he also exist in reality? Something that is not imaginary or something that is a real being. This is where the argument takes a turn. Anselm says that if the argument or God is only in the understanding, then we can think of something greater than him, something that does exist in the understanding and in reality. This contradicts Anselm's argument by saying that the being than which no greater can be conceived is also at the same time a being than which something greater can be conceived. It means that there is something greater than God that can be understood to exist in the understanding and in reality. Anselm then says that that cannot be the case, and that there is no possibility of that. So this means that being than which no greater can be conceived exists both in the mind and in reality. And since this argument is God, then God never did just exist in the understanding of a person, but he also exists in reality. That concludes chapter 2 of the Proslogion. In chapter 3, however, Anselm concludes this argument by saying that God possesses existence to the highest degree. It's not just Anselm addressing God, it shows us how God is. This work, this prayer shows us how God is. That God's being is necessary, and it is not conceivable that God does not exist. Now let us move on to the next part of this segment, which is going to be tackled by my partner, Bea.
To answer the question concerning God's existence, St. Thomas Aquinas presented 5 ways in his most notable work, the Summa Theologica. These ways draw proof or evidence for man's experience with the world. Each of these 5 ways are supposed to provide an argument that God exists. The first 3 arguments are kind of similar to each other in a way that they all deal with saying you have to trace something back from the things we observe in the world to some original cause. Meaning, you trace it back to a single cause that provides an explanation for how everything works. To dig deeper into these 5 arguments, let us tackle them one by one. Beginning with the first argument, the argument from motion. After observing objects in motion, Aquinas was convinced that whatever is currently in motion were once at rest but had changed states when it was moved by something else. This mover was something that was once at rest as well, but was also moved by something else. This could go on and on as an infinite series of things being movers and being moved. So, if this series of events needed something to begin the movement, then at the very beginning of the infinite series is the first mover, which starts the movement. Aquinas described this first mover as the unmoved mover. It is defined as one that is not caused or moved by anything other than itself. And for Aquinas, this is God. Moving on, the second argument is the argument from causation. The main idea in this argument is that every object, action, or event has an efficient cause, entity, or event responsible for its creation or change. For example, a baby's efficient cause is their parents, whose efficient cause are their own parents, and so on and so forth. This means that nothing comes from nothing. Therefore, we can trace back as far as we want to in the order of causality, and there has to be some original first cause just as much as we need a prime mover to get everything going. Aquinas used these dependent relationships to show that every person or object in the world depends on a creator, and that this creator also has its own creator. Then, this new creator has its own efficient cause. It is then logical to assume that at the very beginning, there is the existence of a first maker, or an uncaused cause, which, as the name suggests, is the efficient cause that is not caused by others or anything but itself. This uncaused cause is attributed by Aquinas to the Christian God. The third argument is the argument from contingency. This argument necessitates the distinction between necessary and possible beings. Possible beings are beings that can be created and corrupted, or are beings that can exist and not exist. For example, a man is a possible being because we have the potential to exist through birth and the potential to not exist through death. With this, it is reasonable to think that since most beings in the world are possible beings, there must have been a time that they had not existed at all, which means that nothing ever existed. Meaning, with this pure non existence, nothing could currently exist because nothingness can only yield nothingness. This being is called a necessary being. These are beings that necessarily exist and are beings that cannot be non existent. For Aquinas, there must be at least one necessary being to exist at the very beginning for the rest of the beings to be able to exist. This being is God. Moving on, the fourth argument is the argument from the degrees of perfection. This argument makes use of man's knowledge of perfection and his tendency to judge or evaluate whether an object or a person is more or less perfect. This action of judging something to be less or more perfect means that there is a standard use for the said evaluation. Now, the question is, how could man ever have such standards unless there is a being that is all perfect to compare to it? Aquinas affirms the existence of such perfect being and says that if any other being would be compared or evaluated against such perfection, they would always be judged as less perfect. He calls this all perfect being God, the highest level of being, and the reason why there are levels of being to begin with. Now, the fifth and last argument is the argument from final causes or design. Aquinas drew on the notions of causality as presented by Aristotle to justify this argument. According to Aristotle, the final cause states that the end, that for the sake of which a thing is done. This can also be defined as the cause that refers to the purpose of which a specific object or entity has been created to fulfill. Humans and other beings in the world have been designed to have a purpose, and we behave or act according to it. For example, a bird's wings behave in accordance with its design, which allows it to fly. Humans talk using their mouths because this is in accordance with their body's design, which allows them to utilize air and various muscles in their body to create sounds. The reason why there is the order and goodness within all the different things that we observe is because there's some sort of rational governance that is taking place. For Aquinas, if there is a design that is set in our world, then there must be a designer. This designer cannot possibly just be humans or other natural beings themselves, as Aquinas describes man as imperfect or not intelligent enough to set such a grand design. The design of the world, then, must have been set by a being that is vastly more intelligent than humans and knowledgeable enough to guide them towards their end. This, of course, is God. And that concludes our report about the ontological argument of St. Anselm of Canterbury and the five ways of St. Thomas Aquinas. Thank you for listening.